Today, we're going to uncover the incredibly diverse and absolutely essential jobs that birds perform for our planet. Now, we usually appreciate birds for their beautiful songs or their bright plumage, right? But today, we're looking at them through a totally different lens, as a highly specialized ecological workforce. This is a massive global team executing day-to-day tasks that not only keep our ecosystems functioning, but actually save human economies billions of dollars. To really wrap our heads around this, think about this crazy contrast for a second. What could a tiny, delicate, nectar-sipping hummingbird possibly have in common with a massive, prehistoric-looking scavenger like a condor? Well, it turns out both are incredibly specialized in their ecological roles. And because they're so specialized, both are uniquely vulnerable to the ways we humans alter their environments. On one end of the spectrum, we have our delicate pollinators, and on the absolute other end, the heavy-duty sanitation crew. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with nature's feathered workforce, move into hummingbirds as tiny pollination powerhouses, shift to vultures as the ultimate cleanup crew, examine the California condor paradox, and finally look at how we can go about protecting our avian allies. Let's kick things off with part 1, nature's feathered workforce, and their essential roles in our ecosystem. And zooming right into part 2, hummingbirds are tiny pollination powerhouses. So there are over 300 species of hummingbirds in the world, and they are found exclusively in the Western Hemisphere. We're talking everywhere from the chill of southeastern Alaska all the way down to southern Chile. But these incredible little birds are facing some really serious challenges right now. Because they're often adapted to feed on just a single type of flower or live in a very specific climate, they are super sensitive to environmental changes. Our tropical species down in Central and South America are especially at risk because their native habitats are rapidly being converted into agriculture. Throw in climate change, completely altering landscapes, plus invasive plant species bullying and crowding out their native food sources, you've basically got a perfect storm threatening these tiny powerhouses. If we actually want to support them, we have to understand that their survival is tied to a really specific set of resources. Nectar alone actually isn't going to cut it. Sure, they sip nectar by day from annuals, perennials, and shrubs, but they are also fierce little micropredators. They desperately need to eat insects like fruit flies and gnats to get the protein required to fuel their absolutely massive metabolisms. They'll even slurp up tree sap when they can find it. Basically, they need a complex, diverse, and totally native habitat to truly thrive. The good news is you can easily step up and help right at home by creating safe havens for them. First off, plant native nectar plants. Honestly, this is just the absolute best, most natural way to support them. If you do decide to put out feeders, make sure you hang them in the shade so the liquid doesn't spoil, and mix up purified water with 20 to 30% refined white sugar. Never, ever use artificial sweeteners or honey. And definitely skip that red food dye. It is totally unnecessary, and we don't even know the long-term health impacts it has on these little guys. You can also provide running water, like a fountain or a mister, because they absolutely go crazy for moving water. And finally, you can join a citizen science project like eBird to actually help researchers track their populations. All right, taking a big pivot here into part 3, vultures, the ultimate cleanup crew. Talk about a total 180 from our tiny pollinators, right? Let's look at the heavy-duty sanitation workers of the natural world. Vultures are the backbone of an effective scavenger system, and they are biologically equipped to safely digest a diet that is literally crawling with deadly pathogens. Just wrap your mind around this staggering number, 100,000 kilograms. That is how much organic waste vultures consume every single year in East and West Africa alone. By quickly gobbling up carcasses that would otherwise just rot and breed harmful bacteria, they are acting as a totally free, highly efficient waste management service. So what happens when you remove that sanitation crew? Well, the ecological domino effect is terrifying. $1.5 billion US. That is the estimated annual human health cost in India that resulted directly from the catastrophic decline of their vulture populations. Without vultures, dead animals just sit there, rotting incredibly slowly, and opportunistic scavengers completely take over. In India, the lack of vultures led to a massive explosion in feral dog populations, which then triggered a huge spike in deadly rabies cases. Given that 95% of global rabies cases happen in Africa and Southeast Asia, vultures are providing a literal life-saving buffer between deadly diseases and human populations. It really all boils down to one simple, unavoidable truth. The ecological and human health benefits provided by vultures far, far outweigh the cost of protecting them. Investing in the conservation of these often misunderstood birds is quite literally a direct investment in global human health and economic stability. If we lose vultures, we don't just lose a cool bird. We lose our frontline defense against diseases spilling over from wildlife into our communities and livestock.
Which leads us perfectly into part 4, the California condor paradox.
This is one of the most fascinating and honestly tragic case studies in the world of conservation. The California condor is one of the most intensively managed scavengers on Earth, and the effort to pull this species back from the brink of extinction has been monumental. By the 1980s, a terrible mix of overharvesting, habitat loss, and poisoning had reduced the wild population to just 21 individuals, just 21 birds left on the entire planet. Think about how wild that is. In a desperate, last-ditch effort, every single remaining wild bird was captured and brought into captivity. Reintroductions finally kicked off in 1992, but conservationists quickly hit a wall. The wild environment they were putting the birds back into was still highly toxic, which eventually pushed California to pass strict regulations on lead ammunition by 2008. But here is the really scary part. Even today, lead poisoning from spent ammunition is still a pervasive, deadly threat to their survival. A massive 15-year longitudinal study analyzed blood lead levels in these reintroduced condors, and the results were alarming. Despite those 2008 regulations meant to limit lead ammunition, elevated lead exposure is still a constant, unrelenting threat. In fact, the annual prevalence of elevated lead exposure ranged anywhere from 62% to an absolutely staggering 91% of the sampled birds. To understand why this keeps happening, we have to look at how these birds actually behave in the wild. As condors stretch their wings and fly further away from their highly managed, super safe release sites, places like Big Sur or Pinnacles National Park, their exposure to contaminated food goes way up. See, conservationists frequently leave clean, safe carrion right at those release sites for the birds to eat. But as the population grows and they naturally start exploring vast tracts of public and private land, they start scavenging naturally available carcasses, like hunter-shot deer or feral pigs. And unfortunately, those carcasses frequently contain highly fragmented lead ammunition. And here is the absolute tragic irony of it all, what we call the conservation paradox. The ultimate goal of reintroducing any endangered species is for them to become fully wild, to range far and wide, and to not need humans anymore. But for the California condor, achieving that exact success is what penalizes them. Spending more time away from the release sites, ignoring the safe human-provided food, and expanding their territories is exactly what dramatically increases their risk of swallowing lethal amounts of lead. The data spells it out perfectly. Older, more dominant birds who forge their own path are sadly the ones taking the biggest hit. Condors that are 3 years or older have significantly higher blood lead levels than the younger ones. Why? Well, vultures feed communally, but they have a very strict age-based dominance hierarchy. The older birds always push their way in to get first access to a carcass, and they usually start feeding right at the bullet wound channel, which is exactly where the lead fragmentation is the highest. It's a heartbreaking reality. The absolute best, most independent wild foragers are the ones most likely to be poisoned. Finally, let's look at part 5, protecting our avian allies. From planting a patch of native nectar flowers for a tiny hummingbird to realizing the massive economic value of the often overlooked vulture to advocating for non-lead ammunition to save the majestic condor, human action is the deciding factor here. The science is crystal clear, folks. These birds simply cannot adapt fast enough to the hazards we've introduced to their environments, but they respond incredibly well when we clean up our act and remove those hazards. So whether it's mixing up a fresh batch of plain white sugar water for your porch, filling your garden with native plants, or supporting policies that get toxic heavy metals out of the food chain, you are an essential part of this ecological story. The feathered workforce is out there right now, doing its job to keep our world alive. So what steps will you take today to make sure they're around to do it again tomorrow?